Fashion and beauty in wartime Germany form one of the most revealing yet often overlooked dimensions of life under the Nazi regime, illuminating how politics, ideology, propaganda, scarcity, and human resilience intertwined during one of the darkest periods in modern history. While wars typically reshape economies, governments, and international borders, they also profoundly influence how people dress, groom, and present themselves. In Nazi Germany, personal appearance became more than a matter of style or taste. It was transformed into a political instrument, a reflection of loyalty, and, in many ways, a battleground for identity. The regime meticulously crafted an ideal of femininity built around notions of racial purity, modesty, natural beauty, and domestic functionality, and women were expected to embody these expectations both in public and private life. This ideal was reinforced through propaganda images, women's organizations, school curricula, magazines, posters, and even the rules governing cosmetics and hair. Yet beneath this rigid ideological framework, the reality of everyday life, especially as wartime shortages intensified, created a complex landscape where conformity, creativity, and quiet resistance coexisted. Fashion in wartime Germany thus reveals not only the regime's control over bodies and identities, but also the subtle ways individuals preserved their autonomy amid oppression. The Nazi vision of beauty was carefully constructed as part of a broader ideological blueprint that connected physical appearance to racial ideology and national duty. Long before the war began, the regime had begun promoting a specific image of the ideal German woman: healthy, athletic, modestly dressed, fresh-faced, and natural, far removed from the glamorous cosmopolitan or avant-garde fashion trends popular in Weimar Germany. This shift was not accidental but central to the Nazi effort to redefine womanhood as rooted in motherhood, domestic productivity, and racial contribution. The notion of beauty was therefore never neutral; it was imbued with political purpose. A woman's body was understood as a vessel for the nation's future, and her appearance became a visible demonstration of her suitability for this role. Cosmetics were restricted, elaborate hairstyles discouraged, and foreign fashions condemned as decadent or un-German. The state intervened even in minor matters. Women's magazines were edited to reflect ideological messages. Film actresses were pressured to adhere to natural styles, and the Hitler Youth and BDM, League of German Girls, were used to instill grooming expectations from childhood. When the war began, these ideological foundations collided with everyday realities. Rationing, scarcity, and material shortages profoundly affected clothing production, access to cosmetics, and the very possibilities of personal appearance. Fabrics were repurposed for military use, and civilians were urged to salvage, repair, and rework garments rather than buy new ones. The make-do-and-mend culture that emerged reflected both necessity and ideological discipline. Women were expected to be resourceful, modest, and self-sufficient. Yet despite these hardships, an ecosystem of creativity emerged. Women adapted drab clothing into stylish garments, traded or bartered for precious accessories, and crafted homemade beauty solutions from household materials. These adaptations reveal a human desire to maintain dignity and expression despite conditions that demanded austerity. At the same time, the state attempted to use scarcity to reinforce its ideals, arguing that simplicity and practicality were patriotic virtues. Women were encouraged to view their sacrifices not merely as wartime necessities, but as contributions to the national struggle. Hairstyles and makeup also underwent significant transformations during the war years. While official doctrine praised natural beauty and discouraged cosmetics, women continued to value personal grooming as an essential part of identity. Lipstick, powder, perfume, and hair care products became symbols of emotional normalcy and small pleasures amid hardship. Even when supplies disappeared from store shelves, women found creative substitutes. beet juice for lip color, soot for eyeliner, and homemade creams to soften skin damaged by cold or stress. Hairstyles, particularly braids, simple buns, and practical pinned-back styles, became both an ideological symbol and a functional necessity. Yet beneath the boundary between obedience and resistance was often thin. For some, adopting fashionable curls, wearing brighter lipstick, or adding subtle embellishments to clothing was an expression of individuality that defied the state's insistence on uniformity. These quiet acts of self-styling illustrate how beauty practices, even when constrained, became a space of agency rather than mere compliance. Youth organizations played a central role in shaping these norms, especially among girls. The BDM, designed to cultivate the next generation of German women, combined physical training with moral instruction, teaching girls that their appearance was a reflection of racial health and ideological loyalty. Uniforms minimized class distinctions and reinforced conformity. Grooming inspections taught discipline, and lessons on hygiene were framed as national duty rather than personal preference. Yet even within this highly controlled environment, individuality surfaced. Through slight deviations in hairstyle, subtle accessories, or private experimentation with cosmetics. At the same time, the growing responsibilities placed on girls as the war intensified, labor service, agricultural work, civil defense tasks, complicated their relationship with beauty standards. The tension between ideological femininity and practical necessity revealed contradictions in the regime's expectations, exposing gaps between propaganda and lived experience. As the war progressed and hardship deepened, a paradox emerged. While the regime demanded conformity and modesty, the stresses of wartime life intensified women's desire for self-expression. Fashion became a realm where rebellion could occur quietly, subtly, and symbolically. Some youth, especially the swing movement and Edelweiss pirates, embraced American jazz culture, flamboyant clothing, and bold hairstyles as a direct challenge to Nazi ideals. Others resisted in more discreet ways, such as altering uniforms, wearing forbidden accessories, or copying Hollywood-inspired styles. Even seemingly small acts, such as styling hair in curls, shortening skirts, or wearing trousers, took on political meaning in a society where appearance was tied to loyalty. These forms of aesthetic dissent demonstrate that fashion, far from trivial, can become a powerful language of autonomy when public life is dominated by authoritarian control. The legacy of wartime beauty standards did not vanish when the Nazi regime fell in 1945. Instead, post-war Germany inherited a complex mixture of ideological residue, wartime habits, cultural trauma, and new opportunities for expression. The immediate post-war years were marked by devastation and scarcity, yet women continued to prioritize appearance as a means of preserving dignity. Makeshift clothing, repurposed materials, and black market cosmetics flourished, reflecting both practical need and a longing for normalcy. When Germany later divided into East and West, the two states developed distinct beauty cultures. West Germany embraced consumerism and glamour as symbols of recovery, while East Germany promoted modesty and practicality shaped by socialist ideals. Yet these diverging paths carried echoes of the wartime past. Thriftiness in both states stemmed from years of scarcity, while expectations around women's grooming and domestic appearance bore traces of earlier ideological teachings, even if the original messages had been stripped of political content. In wartime Germany, beauty was far more than a matter of appearance. It was a carefully engineered ideological weapon crafted by the Nazi state to shape the minds, loyalties, and behaviors of its female population. The regime understood early on that aesthetics could serve political ends. The way a woman looked, dressed, and carried herself could reinforce the values the state wished to cultivate. Beauty, in this context, was not a personal expression, but a symbol of racial ideology, national identity, and total submission to the goals of the Reich. The ideological blueprint for beauty in Nazi Germany was rooted in the party's broader racial theories. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle frequently emphasized that the German woman was the biological and cultural foundation of the nation. For the Nazi leadership, women played a role distinct from but equally essential to men to nurture, reproduce, and safeguard the purity of the so-called Aryan race. As such, the female body became a battlefield on which political and racial ideals were inscribed. Every detail, from hairstyle to posture, was interpreted as an outward reflection of one's inner allegiance to the nation. Propaganda played a central role in codifying these beauty standards. Magazines like Frauenwarte, the official women's publication of the Nazi Party, delivered meticulously crafted messages about how a proper German woman should look and behave. These publications blended fashion advice with ideological lessons, teaching women that modesty, cleanliness, and natural beauty were not merely aesthetic choices, but patriotic duties. Posters, films, and educational materials reinforced these messages, creating a cultural environment in which beauty and politics became inseparable. A significant part of the ideological framework rested on contrast, on defining what a German woman was by emphasizing what she was not. Through propaganda, the regime contrasted the so-called natural beauty of Aryan women with the allegedly decadent styles of foreign cultures. Bright makeup, elaborate hairstyles, flamboyant clothing, and ostentatious accessories were portrayed as symbols of weakness or moral corruption. By rejecting these styles, the Nazi state argued, German women demonstrated both racial purity and moral strength. Beauty became a political boundary, marking those inside and outside the national community. The political dimensions of beauty also appeared in the strict gender roles promoted by the regime. Women were portrayed as guardians of domestic stability, their physical appearance expected to mirror their assigned societal roles. The ideal beauty was modest, calm, pure, and supportive, never flamboyant, independent, or provocative. Physical presentation was used to discipline behavior. A woman who adhered to Nazi beauty standards also implicitly accepted the state's expectations regarding motherhood, obedience, and sacrifice. The ideological blueprint thus operated on multiple levels, shaping both the physical self and the social self. Education and training further embedded these messages into women's daily lives. Organizations like the National Socialist Womanhood, NS Frauenschaft, and the German Women's Enterprise, Deutsches Frauenwerk, taught courses on grooming, health, hygiene, and domestic management. These classes were framed not as lifestyle instruction, but as contributions to the war effort. A German woman who maintained a clean, simple appearance was seen as embodying the discipline and strength of the Reich. Even superficial acts, brushing hair, washing clothes, preparing one's face, were politicized as duties to the nation. Central to the ideological purpose of beauty was the state's obsession with racial hygiene. While beauty standards emphasized naturalness, they were also deeply racialized, favoring features associated with the Aryan ideal, light hair, fair skin, and athletic physicality. Photographs of idealized women, often farm workers or young mothers, were circulated to model these traits. The message was unmistakable. Beauty reflected racial value. Women were encouraged to improve not just their appearance, but the quality of future generations by choosing racially suitable partners and embodying racial ideals. The wartime context intensified these standards. As the regime mobilized its population, women were reminded that their appearance symbolized national strength, even amid scarcity, air raids, and emotional hardship. Maintaining a neat and composed look was framed as an act of patriotic steadfastness. In this way, beauty functioned as psychological armor, one more way to show the world that Germany remained strong, disciplined, and ideologically united. Despite shortages, propaganda urged women to remain attractive in the state-approved manner, reinforcing the idea that beauty and morale were intertwined. However, this ideological framework was riddled with contradictions. While the Nazi leadership glorified simplicity and modesty, elite party members, especially the circle around figures like Magda Goebbels, often indulged in luxury fashion, expensive cosmetics, and high-end grooming products. These mixed messages revealed the hypocrisy inherent in the system. Nevertheless, the average German woman was held to a strict standard that left little room for individual expression. The blueprint continued to shape female identity throughout the war, dictating not only how women looked, but how they perceived their own worth. By the late years of the war, beauty had become both a symbol of loyalty and a form of propaganda resilience. Photographs of well-groomed women working in factories, fields, and hospitals were used to portray an image of unstoppable national endurance. The ideological instructions surrounding beauty thus served dual purposes. They maintained control over the female population and crafted a public illusion of unity and strength. In this way, the beauty standards of wartime Germany left a deep imprint on both the society of the period and the generations that followed. This chapter provides the foundation for understanding how beauty in Nazi Germany was never merely cosmetic. It was a political instrument, carefully shaped, propagated, and enforced to support the regime's larger goals. In the chapters that follow, the narrative will expand into the specific expectations placed upon women, the restrictions imposed by wartime scarcity, the evolution of hairstyles and makeup, the training of girls through youth organizations, and the subtle forms of resistance that emerged. Together, these themes reveal the complex role of beauty in a society where appearance was inseparable from ideology. The Nazi regime did not merely encourage a particular vision of womanhood, it engineered it with precision, shaping every aspect of the female identity, from appearance to behavior. The ideal German woman was not an organic cultural figure, but a political construct designed to embody the regime's racial, social, and ideological expectations. Her beauty, her duties, her mannerisms, and even her emotional landscape were all regulated by an elaborate ideological apparatus. This chapter explores that carefully constructed ideal, examining how the Nazi state defined womanhood and how these expectations influenced daily life. At the center of the ideal stood the principle of natural beauty. Nazi ideology insisted that the German woman should present herself without excessive artifice. While cosmetics were not banned outright, their use was strongly discouraged. Makeup was portrayed as foreign, vain, or morally questionable, qualities the regime associated with cultures it wished to distance itself from. Thus, heavy lipstick, bright eyeshadow, and elaborate beauty routines were labeled un-German. The ideal woman wore only minimal makeup, used subtle colors, and celebrated her natural complexion. In propaganda, she was shown with fresh skin, simple hairstyles, and an unpretentious appearance meant to signal health, purity, and racial strength. Wartime Germany was a society under immense pressure, and nowhere was this strain more visible than in the realm of everyday appearance. As the conflict deepened, women found themselves navigating a world of scarcity, rationing, and continuous adaptation. Fashion did not simply evolve under these conditions, it was fundamentally reshaped. The stylish ideals promoted by the Nazi regime became increasingly difficult to uphold as materials vanished from store shelves, transportation systems faltered, and economic hardship intensified. In this chapter, we explore how German women adapted to these challenges, how the state responded, and how wartime restrictions transformed fashion into a reflection of both resilience and ideological conformity. Rationing began early in the war and quickly affected every aspect of women's wardrobes. Textiles such as cotton, wool, silk, and leather became scarce as the military claimed priority over civilian needs. Factories that once produced clothing shifted to manufacturing uniforms, parachutes, and equipment. As a result, civilians faced severe limitations. Clothing ration cards were introduced, restricting purchases not only by quantity but also by quality. A single coat might require months' worth of ration coupons, forcing women to plan carefully and make difficult choices. Scarcity transformed clothing into a precious commodity, and women learned to preserve, repair, and repurpose garments in ways they had not imagined before the war. Silk and nylon were among the first materials to disappear from civilian markets due to their military uses. Silk, essential for parachute production, became practically unattainable. Nylon, still a relatively new invention, was reserved for war-related needs. This created a ripple effect on fashion trends. Stockings, once an essential component of respectable dress, were suddenly in short supply. Women adapted creatively, using brown or beige makeup to paint artificial stockings on their legs. Some even drew seams with eyebrow pencils to mimic the appearance of real hosiery. These improvised solutions demonstrated both ingenuity and the expanding pressure to maintain an appropriate appearance despite severe shortages. Rationing also extended to footwear. Leather was diverted to military boot production, leaving civilians with limited options. Shoes were often made with wooden soles, canvas tops, or substitute materials. While these alternatives were functional, they lacked durability and comfort. Women learned to repair shoes repeatedly, gluing or stitching them until they were nearly unusable. In rural areas, clogs made a comeback, becoming a practical, if not fashionable, solution. The sound of wooden soles on cobblestone streets became a familiar rhythm of wartime life. Despite growing struggles, propaganda insisted that women should continue to uphold the modest and natural beauty ideals promoted by the regime. Cleanliness, neatness, and careful grooming were emphasized as patriotic acts. The state frequently reminded women that appearance is morale, arguing that a well-presented civilian population reflected the discipline of the nation. This messaging created pressure on women to maintain an orderly appearance even as the means to do so dwindled. Consequently, resourcefulness became essential. Women repurposed old clothing, shared sewing patterns, and exchanged tips on conserving fabrics. Magazines offered guidance on making do, instructions for turning men's shirts into blouses, or re-dyeing dresses or creating children's clothing from worn-out garments. One of the most widespread adaptations was the practice of patching and mending. Although once considered unfashionable or a sign of poverty, repairs became normalized and even celebrated. Women took pride in their ability to extend the life of a garment through careful stitching. Visible mending became a badge of frugality and resilience, aligning with the regime's narrative of sacrifice for the greater good. This shift in attitudes reflected the broader wartime ethos, where practicality took precedence over luxury and waste was viewed as unpatriotic. The regime also took steps to regulate fashion through the creation of standardized clothing designs. The wartime utility clothing programs, though less formalized than similar initiatives in Britain, encouraged manufacturers to produce simple, durable garments that required fewer materials. These designs typically featured straight cuts, minimal embellishment, and standardized sizing. While the goal was to conserve resources, the effect was a homogenization of women's wardrobes. Individual expression through clothing became increasingly limited as personality gave way to practicality. Accessories, too, were affected by wartime restrictions. Metal shortages curtailed the production of jewelry, buttons, and decorative buckles. Women turned to alternative materials, such as wood, glass, or cloth, to create accessories. Handmade brooches and hairpins became popular, showcasing the creativity of women determined to retain a sense of femininity despite material shortages. Even belts and handbags were redesigned to use minimal metal components. The accessory trends that emerged during this period offer a unique glimpse into how fashion adapted to the constraints of wartime industry. Cosmetics, though discouraged by ideology, remained important to many women. However, these too became difficult to obtain. Ingredients for perfume, soap, and makeup were diverted to chemical and medical needs. Women learned to create homemade beauty products, face creams mixed from household ingredients, perfumes made from garden flowers, or lip color tinted with beet juice. These inventions, while simple, represented a quiet assertion of individuality. They allowed women to maintain a connection to femininity that felt increasingly distant amid the harsh realities of war. The growing scarcity forced households to revive old skills. Sewing, knitting, and handicrafting became essential parts of daily life. Many women who had never learned to sew became proficient out of necessity. Sewing circles, often organized by community groups, provided spaces where women could exchange materials, share advice, and repair garments together. These gatherings fostered a sense of solidarity, demonstrating how practical tasks also reinforced community bonds. In rural areas, older traditions, such as weaving and spinning, experienced a brief resurgence. As shortages deepened, women faced the moral question of whether to follow the ideological prescriptions of modesty or adopt alternative styles inspired by foreign influences. American and British fashion trends, though officially disapproved, still filtered into German society through movies, photographs, and confiscated goods. Some women adopted slightly shorter hemlines or bolder hairstyles, subtle acts of deviation that reflected personal preference rather than outright rebellion. However, these small choices sometimes led to social criticism, particularly from party officials who policed public appearance. Wartime fashion also reflected the increasing participation of women in labor roles. As men were drafted into the military, women entered factories, offices, and farms in unprecedented numbers. Their clothing consequently shifted toward practicality. The regime reluctantly accepted trousers for women in certain labor settings, though they stopped short of endorsing them for everyday wear. Overalls, aprons, and work uniforms became staples. Practical clothing symbolized both necessity and new forms of feminine strength, even if the regime struggled to reconcile this with its traditional ideals. Yet, even as women adapted to practical clothing, the pressure to maintain ideological beauty standards persisted. Propaganda frequently reminded women that their sacrifices were noble and that their appearance should reflect dignity, discipline, and devotion. The contradiction between the demands of daily survival and the ideological expectations imposed from above created a tension that defined the wartime experience. In the final years of the war, as conditions worsened dramatically, fashion became almost entirely utilitarian. Bombings destroyed shops, supply routes collapsed, and occupation forces seized remaining resources. Women scavenged, improvised, and repurposed like never before, but despite these hardships, many continued to take pride in their appearance, finding small ways to maintain normalcy and dignity amid chaos. Wartime Germany was defined by scarcity, disruption, and constant uncertainty. Yet within this environment, women continued to navigate expectations surrounding beauty. Hairstyles, makeup, and grooming practices became powerful symbols of resilience, discipline, and ideological loyalty. Even as bombs fell, factories closed, and basic goods disappeared from shelves, the pressure to maintain a tidy, natural, and modest appearance persisted. Beauty, within the confines of Nazi-approved standards, became both a coping mechanism and a carefully policed cultural expectation. This chapter explores the ways in which women adapted their grooming practices during the war, revealing both creativity and contradiction in the pursuit of beauty amid hardship. Hairstyles played a central role in defining the appearance of the ideal German woman. The regime promoted hairstyles that were natural, neat, and practical. Long hair was preferred, as it aligned with traditional femininity and symbolized health and fertility, qualities the state upheld as essential. However, the style in which hair was worn mattered greatly. Elaborate, glamorous hairstyles were discouraged. Instead, women were urged to wear simple arrangements such as braids, buns, or pinned waves. These styles projected modesty and discipline while requiring minimal products at a time when supplies were increasingly limited. One of the most iconic wartime hairstyles was the braided crown, hair woven around the head in a circular pattern. This style was celebrated in propaganda images for its neatness, functionality, and rural associations. It evoked the image of the hardworking, pure German woman rooted in tradition and community. While not all women adopted it, it became a recognizable symbol of the era. Equally popular were pinned curls or soft waves, but these were simplified from pre-war versions due to the scarcity of setting lotions and equipment. Curling irons were hard to obtain, and electricity was unreliable in many regions, prompting women to use heat-free methods like rag curls or braiding damp hair overnight to achieve waves. Hair care routines also changed significantly due to wartime conditions. Soap and shampoo were rationed, forcing women to find creative alternatives. Many used homemade rinses made from vinegar, beer, or herbal infusions. These mixtures not only cleaned the hair, but also added shine and manageability, offering women a sense of normalcy amid deprivation. Brushes and combs were treasured household items, repaired repeatedly to extend their lifespan. Despite limited resources, women remained committed to cleanliness, aligning with ideological expectations that equated good grooming with moral discipline. Makeup during the wartime years existed in a delicate balance between ideology and personal desire. The Nazi regime discouraged glamorous cosmetics, portraying them as foreign, superficial, and incompatible with the natural beauty of the German woman. Heavy makeup was especially criticized, often framed as a sign of moral weakness. Nevertheless, many women continued to use makeup in subtle ways, despite shortages and social scrutiny. Lipstick, in particular, retained its popularity. While bright shades were frowned upon, muted tones such as soft reds or rosy browns were common. The challenge, however, was obtaining these products. Cosmetic shortages pushed women toward remarkable resourcefulness. When commercial lipstick became unavailable, women improvised by mixing colored waxes, beet juice, or berry stains. Face powder, scarce due to ingredient rationing, was often replaced with mixtures of cornstarch or finely ground rice flour. Homemade creams crafted from household fats or simple herbal infusions provided basic skin care. These products were not luxurious, but they allowed women to maintain a sense of femininity and control during a time when much of daily life felt unpredictable. Perfume, once a cherished element of women's beauty routines, became a rare luxury. Many commercial fragrances disappeared as factories shifted to producing chemical supplies for the war. Women turned to homemade scents made from flower petals, herbs, and alcohol substitutes. These improvised perfumes, while faint, carried emotional significance. A small dab on the wrist or neck served as a reminder of pre-war life, a personal anchor amid hardship. Eyebrows, a subtle yet important element of grooming, were typically kept natural. Plucking was common, but moderate, in keeping with the natural aesthetic encouraged by the regime. Kohl and mascara were harder to obtain, as chemical ingredients were diverted to military use. Women used burned matchsticks, soot, or diluted charcoal to darken lashes and brows, methods known for generations but revived out of necessity during the war. Hair care also shifted due to shortages. Nail polish, though available early in the war, became scarce as the conflict intensified. Women buffed their nails to create a natural shine, using homemade oils or creams to keep them healthy. Clean, neatly trimmed nails aligned with the state's ideals of hygiene and modesty, and their maintenance offered a small but meaningful ritual for women seeking stability amid the chaos. Grooming extended beyond cosmetic appearance. The Nazi state placed significant emphasis on hygiene as a reflection of racial purity and discipline. Cleanliness was framed as a civic duty, even when water shortages, bomb damage, and daily hardships made it difficult. Women adapted by using minimal water, relying on sponge baths, and stretching the use of soap. Despite these challenges, they maintained grooming routines as a form of resilience, finding pride in appearing composed while enduring extreme conditions. Public grooming behaviors also carried ideological weight. Women were expected to present themselves modestly in public spaces, whether in ration lines, workplaces, or shelters. Propaganda encouraged this by showcasing women who remained neat and composed despite rationing or bombings. These images reinforced the message that beauty was not simply aesthetic, it was a symbol of national perseverance. A well-groomed woman was portrayed as one who upheld the spirit of the nation, regardless of her circumstances. Hairstylists and beauticians adapted to wartime limitations by offering services that emphasized simplicity and practicality. Salons used rationed materials sparingly, often relying on creative techniques rather than products. Some stylists became community figures, providing not only grooming services but also a sense of emotional support during difficult times. Women often visited salons not solely for appearance, but for companionship and distraction, making these spaces important cultural sanctuaries. Despite the practical focus of wartime grooming, small acts of beauty frequently took on deeper emotional significance. A dab of homemade perfume, a perfectly braided hairstyle, or a touch of lipstick could lift spirits and reinforce personal identity. For many women, maintaining their appearance was a quiet assertion of dignity, a reminder that even during war, they retained some control over their lives. In Nazi Germany, the molding of girls into the idealized forms of womanhood began long before adulthood. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, commonly known as the BDM, served as the primary institution responsible for shaping the minds, bodies, and appearances of young German girls. While the organization presented itself as a youth movement focused on community, character building, and physical fitness, it also operated as a strategic mechanism for embedding ideological values into every aspect of life. Chief among these values were the regime's expectations for femininity and beauty. This chapter explores how the BDM used appearance as a tool of indoctrination, shaping girls into the living embodiments of Nazi ideals. The BDM was divided by age group, with the Jungmädelbund, for ages 10 to 14, introducing girls to the foundational expectations of behavior, appearance, and loyalty. Even at this young age, girls were taught that their bodies were tied to their future duties as wives and mothers. The organization made clear that physical health was not only a personal virtue, but a national obligation. Girls were encouraged to engage in activities that strengthened their bodies, hiking, running, swimming, and gymnastics, because strong bodies meant strong future mothers capable of producing healthy children. Beauty, therefore, was framed through the lens of vitality. A natural, athletic appearance was celebrated, while signs of fragility or vanity were discouraged. Uniforms played a crucial role in shaping identity within the BDM. The standard uniform consisted of a white blouse, a dark skirt, a brown jacket, and a black necktie, later replaced with a braided rope. This ensemble was deliberately simple, modest, and practical, qualities the regime associated with ideal femininity. The uniform erased class distinctions, preventing girls from signaling wealth or poverty through their clothing. The effect was a powerful homogenization. Every girl looked nearly identical, reinforcing the message that individual vanity had no place in Nazi society. Personal expression was minimized, while discipline and conformity were elevated as virtues. The uniform also taught girls to present themselves neatly and modestly. Wrinkled clothing, unpolished shoes, or messy hair were frowned upon. Leaders often conducted inspections, ensuring that each girl's appearance reflected the values of order and discipline. These inspections served a dual purpose. They reinforced the idea that grooming was an outward sign of inner moral character, and they trained girls to internalize the pressure to maintain the ideal feminine appearance. Even at a young age, girls learned that how they presented themselves was seen as a reflection of their loyalty to the nation. Hairstyles within the BDM were subject to clear expectations. Hair was to be worn simply. Braids, ponytails, or neatly pinned styles were acceptable. Elaborate curls, bright ribbons, and fashionable accessories were discouraged. This emphasis on practicality reflected both ideological and wartime concerns. On the ideological side, simplicity symbolized purity, naturalness, and authentic German femininity. On the practical side, simple hairstyles were easier to maintain during physical activities, marches, and outdoor trainings. Hair dye, considered frivolous and foreign, was strongly discouraged. Girls with naturally light hair, especially blondes, were often celebrated as embodying the Aryan ideal, but the BDM emphasized natural appearance above all. Grooming instruction formed part of the BDM's broader educational mission. Girls were taught how to care for their skin, hair, nails, and general hygiene, but these lessons were always framed within ideological boundaries. Cleanliness was emphasized as a moral responsibility and a reflection of racial purity. Excessive grooming, however, was denounced as vanity. Makeup, in particular, was considered inappropriate for young girls. BDM leaders often warned that cosmetics were decadent, urban, and foreign, characteristics associated with cultures the Nazi regime deemed inferior or corrupt. Girls were taught that true beauty came from health, discipline, and naturalness, not artificial enhancements. The BDM also used physical fitness as a foundation for shaping ideals of femininity. Athletics were not encouraged for competition or self-expression, but for building strong bodies capable of future motherhood. BDM training involved long hikes, endurance exercises, and outdoor labor, all intended to cultivate stamina. The ideal BDM girl was energetic, healthy, and sun-kissed, not pale, frail, or delicate. This athletic aesthetic became a hallmark of Nazi-era femininity, reflecting the belief that a woman's physical condition directly influenced the strength of the nation's future generations. Beyond grooming and fitness, the BDM played a significant role in psychological shaping. Girls were taught that their appearance mattered not for personal identity, but for collective symbolism. A well-groomed BDM girl represented order, purity, and racial pride. Her healthy body was a contribution to the future of the German people. Her modest appearance showed loyalty and discipline. These lessons created a powerful internalization of external expectations. Many girls grew to police their own appearance strictly, feeling pride in meeting the standards set by the organization. However, the BDM was not without contradictions. While it promoted modesty and natural beauty, it also glamorized the Aryan ideal in ways that indirectly encouraged comparison and self-criticism. Propaganda posters often depicted tall, athletic, smiling blonde girls with braided hair and bright expressions. These idealized images set standards that many girls felt pressure to meet. Girls who did not fit the Aryan mold sometimes felt excluded or subtly judged, even as leaders insisted that all loyal German girls were valued. The tension between proclaimed inclusivity and the visual emphasis on racialized beauty created psychological challenges for many youth. The war intensified these contradictions. As boys joined the Hitler Youth and later the military, the BDM expanded its responsibilities. Girls were increasingly called upon to perform labor normally done by men, harvesting crops, assisting in civil defense, or supporting military hospitals. Their appearance had to balance practicality with ideological expectations. For example, while trousers were forbidden for everyday wear, they were grudgingly permitted for certain labor tasks. Even then, girls were expected to maintain feminine grooming standards, reinforcing the idea that femininity was a constant obligation regardless of circumstances. BDM education also emphasized the future role of girls as mothers, and appearance was tied closely to this expectation. Leaders frequently reminded girls that they were the bearers of the nation, responsible for producing strong offspring. Their physical condition, grooming habits, and hygienic practices were presented as early training for motherhood. These lessons instilled the belief that every aspect of personal appearance, even posture, contributed to their eventual fulfillment of biological and national duties. Despite the heavy ideological pressures, many girls found genuine community and enjoyment in the BDM. Friendship, shared experiences, and group identity created bonds that softened the impact of ideological rigidity. Activities such as singing, hiking, and group gatherings often provided joy and camaraderie. In these moments, appearance became less about discipline and more about shared identity. Nonetheless, the organization's underlying purpose, to shape the ideal German woman, was always present. In some cases, girls rebelled quietly against appearance standards. Some experimented with subtle makeup, copied foreign hairstyles seen in movies, or accessorized their uniforms in small ways. These acts of individuality, while rare and often risky, revealed that beauty standards were not always fully internalized. However, open defiance was dangerous, as BDM leaders and community members closely monitored girls' behavior. By the final years of the war, as resources dwindled and hardship intensified, BDM appearance standards loosened slightly in practice, though not in ideology. Uniforms became harder to replace, grooming routines were disrupted, and physical fitness activities were limited by wartime destruction. Yet the organization continued to preach the same ideals, even when they were no longer realistic for many girls to maintain. While Nazi Germany imposed rigorous expectations on women's appearances, from clothing to grooming to public behavior, everyday life during wartime revealed a fascinating paradox. Even under an authoritarian regime obsessed with control, beauty and fashion became subtle forms of resistance, personal expression, and quiet rebellion. Women found ways to push back against ideological standards without openly challenging the state. Their choices, sometimes bold and sometimes barely noticeable, reflected the human desire for individuality, dignity, and joy, even in the darkest circumstances. This chapter explores these complex tensions and illuminates how fashion served both as a political tool and a political defiance during wartime Germany. Wartime Germany was a society where appearance was carefully scrutinized. Clothing, hairstyles, and grooming were not merely personal decisions, but were interpreted as reflections of loyalty to Nazi ideology. Propaganda promoted the natural German woman, modest and unadorned, while denouncing foreign fashion influences as decadent, un-German, or racially corrupt. Yet beneath these rigid structures, many women forged personal paths. Their acts of self-styling often signaled subtle resistance, quiet, private pushbacks against conformity. These actions rarely amounted to overt defiance, but they served as emotional and psychological assertions of identity. Clothing shortages due to rationing intensified this paradox. With textile production redirected to the military, fabric became scarce, and consumer clothing was restricted. The regime expected women to rely on simplicity, practicality, and the reuse of old garments. Many complied out of necessity, but others leveraged resourcefulness to express creativity. Skills like sewing, mending, tailoring, and repurposing fabrics allowed women to maintain personal style despite scarcity. Turning an old coat into a stylish jacket or adding embroidered trim to a plain dress became small rebellions, expressions of individuality not sanctioned by ideology. Foreign fashion presented another layer of conflict. The regime condemned American, French, and British styles as symbols of cultural contamination. Short skirts, jazz-age makeup, and Hollywood-inspired hairdos were criticized as immoral or Jewish-influenced. Yet young women continued to follow global trends, especially those who listened to banned radio broadcasts, watched smuggled films, or admired foreign magazines. Even when certain looks were forbidden, women found discreet ways to incorporate them. Slightly shorter hemlines, subtle curls, or stylish accessories. These touches may seem minor, but within a tightly controlled society, they carried immense symbolic weight. There were also those who engaged in bolder forms of resistance. Swing youth, Edelweiss pirates, and other anti-Nazi youth groups used fashion deliberately as a form of defiance. Swing girls embraced American-style skirts, painted nails, glamorous hairstyles, and jazz-infused aesthetics. Their clothing directly opposed the uniformity and simplicity promoted by the regime. For them, fashion was not just style, it was a declaration of cultural allegiance to the free world. The authorities recognized this symbolism and often punished such deviation harshly. Still, the movement's defiant fashion choices survived as one of the clearest examples of aesthetic resistance. Women working in wartime industries faced additional tensions. As factories demanded female labor, women adopted practical garments, pants, overalls, and headscarves, out of necessity. While Nazi ideology insisted women maintain feminine dress, the reality of war contradicted these ideals. Many women discovered newfound comfort, efficiency, and autonomy in practical clothing, which subtly challenged traditional gender norms. Though the regime tolerated these adaptations for labor purposes, it remained deeply uncomfortable with women adopting styles associated with masculine practicality. By wearing such garments confidently, women reshaped wartime gender boundaries. Makeup, publicly discouraged yet privately desired, was another battlefield of quiet resistance. The regime framed cosmetics as foreign, decadent, or unnecessary for the pure German woman. But many women continued using lipstick, powder, and eye cosmetics, even as supplies dwindled. Creativity flourished. Beet juice for lip color, soot for eyeliner, or homemade skin creams crafted from household ingredients. These improvised beauty practices represent a poignant form of rebellion. They signified women's refusal to relinquish self-expression and femininity despite pressures to conform to austere ideals. Hairstyles also held symbolic power. Curls, waves, and other stylized looks flirted with fashion deemed non-German. As cinema idols like Marlene Dietrich captivated audiences, even in exile, their influence persisted clandestinely. Women copied these glamorous looks in private, sometimes toning them down in public. Even a single curl pinned behind an ear could serve as a whispered declaration of individuality. Hairstyles allowed women to navigate the thin line between conformity and rebellion, carefully balancing desire and danger. The black market contributed further to aesthetic resistance. Despite rationing, illegal trade networks thrived, supplying lipstick, silk stockings, perfumes, and luxury garments. Women who purchased these goods were not merely indulging vanity, they were rejecting a system that sought to police their choices. Possessing or wearing contraband cosmetics became a way to reclaim personal agency, even when the risk of punishment was real. This clandestine world of fashion underscored how deeply women valued self-expression, especially when the state tried to strip it away. Air raids and destruction complicated women's efforts to maintain personal style. Yet even amid rubble, many clung to beauty rituals as a source of emotional resilience. Maintaining appearance during hardship served as a psychological anchor, a form of self-preservation. Lipstick was famously described in wartime diaries as the last symbol of normalcy, dignity, or hope. Women applied it before going to shelters, before working in rubble-clearing brigades, and even in makeshift kitchens after losing their homes. Their determination to maintain beauty under extreme circumstances defied the Nazi attempt to control not just bodies, but spirits. Social spaces also enabled quiet resistance. Dance halls, gatherings, and private homes became safer environments for fashion experimentation. Away from public scrutiny, women shared tips, traded materials, and crafted styles that defied official expectations. These communal acts fostered solidarity. Beauty in this sense became a shared language of resistance, small gestures of humanity that pushed back against a dehumanizing regime. Not all rebellion was tied to outside influences. Some women resisted simply by prioritizing personal desires over collective demands. Choosing an attractive dress despite ideological demands for modesty or refusing to cut hair in the approved style represented acts of individualism the state could not fully extinguish. Even conformity sometimes masked quiet defiance. A woman might appear ideologically aligned in public but embrace freer fashion choices in private, asserting control over at least a fraction of her life. Importantly, not all resistance was conscious. Some women embraced beauty and fashion out of sheer habit, tradition, or personal taste, rather than ideological opposition. Yet these actions still disrupted the regime's attempt to impose uniformity. Fashion resistance also revealed internal contradictions within the regime itself. Nazi propaganda glamorized the Aryan ideal through stylized posters and films, inadvertently promoting a kind of beauty aspiration that clashed with their calls for modesty. While condemning Hollywood glamour, they created their own gun. These contradictions allowed women to exploit ideological gaps, embracing beauty within a system that hypocritically both demanded and denied it. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 did not immediately erase the beauty standards, fashion habits, or ideological expectations imposed on women during the war. Instead, these influences lingered, transformed, and in some cases hardened into cultural norms that shaped the appearance of German women for decades. The end of the war brought grief, displacement, and scarcity, but it also brought a profound cultural reset. As Germany split into East and West, the two states evolved in opposite directions, each crafting its own vision of femininity, influenced but not defined by the wartime experience. This chapter explores the long-lasting legacy of Nazi-era beauty standards, the shifts that emerged in the post-war period, and the ways these transformations reflected Germany's struggle to rebuild identity, memory, and autonomy. In the immediate aftermath of the war, survival took precedence over personal appearance. Bombed cities left millions homeless, clothing was scarce, and basic grooming supplies were luxury items. Yet even amid devastation, women continued to find ways to express themselves through fashion and beauty. Many diaries from this period describe women sewing clothing from parachute silk, using curtains as dresses, or trading cigarettes for lipstick on the black market. These efforts were not merely superficial. They were acts of reclaiming dignity after years of ideological pressure and wartime hardship. The end of Nazi control over beauty standards brought an immediate collapse of the natural, modest Aryan ideal that the regime had fiercely promoted. Women embraced new styles with enthusiasm. Shorter skirts, bolder makeup, curled hairstyles, and even black market fashion accessories signaled a desire to break away from the austerity and conformity of the previous era. Hollywood influences, once banned, flooded into German culture. Film stars like Rita Hayworth and Ingrid Bergman became new beauty icons, replacing the rigid images of blonde-braided Aryan femininity. This rapid shift reflected a deeper longing for freedom, choice, and modernity. Yet not everything changed at once. Many wartime grooming habits, such as resourcefulness, simplicity, and practicality, remained ingrained, especially among older women who had spent years adapting to scarcity. In some families, the expectation that women maintain neat appearances, clean homes, and disciplined grooming survived into the 1950s and 1960s. Wartime austerity became interwoven with post-war propriety, blending past and present into a new cultural identity. By 1949, Germany split into two states, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Each developed distinct beauty ideologies that reflected broader political values. In West Germany, the economic miracle of the 1950s fueled a return to glamour and consumer culture. Department stores reopened, fashion magazines flourished, and cosmetics became widely available. The new beauty ideal celebrated elegance, sophistication, and affluence. Women embraced fitted dresses, pearl necklaces, red lipstick, and curled hair, a stark contrast to wartime simplicity. This shift represented a deliberate cultural pivot away from the restrictive past and toward a Western, modern identity. However, the pressure on women to uphold domestic femininity remained strong. The 1950s housewife, impeccably groomed and gracefully feminine, echoed elements of Nazi-era ideals about women's domestic roles, albeit without racial ideology. In East Germany, beauty standards evolved under socialist principles that emphasized equality, practicality, and collective identity. While the state did not seek to control women's appearances with the same intensity as the Nazi regime, it promoted a utilitarian aesthetic. Women were expected to be strong workers and active citizens. Hairstyles were practical, clothing modest, and makeup minimal. Glamour was often labeled bourgeois or capitalist. However, even within the socialist system, women found ways to personalize their style. Homemade clothes, subtle makeup, and creative haircuts allowed East German women to assert individuality despite material shortages and ideological expectations. Across both Germanies, wartime skills in sewing, mending, and repurposing fabrics continued to influence fashion culture. Even in the economic boom years, homemade clothing remained common, reflecting a lingering sense of thrift and resourcefulness. Elder generations passed down the ethos of make do and mend, rooting wartime habits deeply into cultural memory. The psychological legacy of wartime beauty standards also persisted. Many women who grew up under Nazi ideology carried its unspoken expectations into adulthood. The pressure to maintain a clean, natural, and disciplined appearance lingered in certain communities. Conversely, younger generations who embraced post-war modernity often rejected these ideals, creating a generational divide. Beauty became a site of negotiation between past trauma and future identity. The cultural reckoning with Nazi ideology also influenced post-war beauty norms. As Germany confronted its past, the glorification of Aryan appearance became taboo. Blonde-braided imagery disappeared from public life. Beauty campaigns and fashion media consciously avoided racialized aesthetics, shifting toward inclusive, global influences. Yet this transition took time. Deep-seated biases did not vanish overnight and continued to shape perceptions subtly for years. The legacy of wartime beauty standards extended into feminism as well. By the 1970s, the women's movement in both East and West Germany began to question traditional beauty expectations, many of which, directly or indirectly, echoed wartime ideology. Feminists criticized the idea that a woman's value was tied to her appearance, domesticity, or reproductive role. They advocated for natural body hair, minimal makeup, and comfortable clothing, not as state-imposed directives, but as personal choices. Interestingly, this movement reclaimed aspects of natural appearance once forced by the Nazi regime, transforming them into symbols of autonomy rather than conformity. Cinematic and artistic representations played a crucial role in reshaping Germany's relationship with beauty. Post-war films portrayed women in diverse roles: widows, rubble collectors, factory workers, nurses, performers, highlighting strength over superficial appearance. Later decades brought more nuanced portrayals of wartime womanhood, allowing society to reinterpret and critique past standards. These cultural expressions helped dismantle rigid beauty ideals and encouraged a more complex understanding of femininity. Another lasting impact of wartime fashion was the normalization of women wearing trousers. Although trousers had initially been worn out of necessity during the war, they became increasingly common in both East and West Germany after 1945. By the 1960s and 1970s, pants were a mainstream wardrobe staple for women, a transformation that began as a wartime contradiction to Nazi ideology and ended as a symbol of modern equality. The reunification of Germany in 1990 brought the differing beauty cultures of East and West together. Over time, global influences, technological innovation, and the rise of the fashion industry helped unify aesthetic trends. Today, Germany's beauty standards reflect international diversity more than national ideology. Yet the legacy of wartime aesthetics still lingers subtly in cultural attitudes toward practicality, minimalism, and natural beauty. Ultimately, the story of wartime beauty standards is not only about control, oppression, or ideology. It is also a story of resilience, creativity, adaptation, and reinvention. The ways women navigated grooming, fashion, and identity during the war shaped not only their personal lives, but the future cultural fabric of Germany. In examining this legacy, one sees a journey from imposed uniformity to reclaimed individuality, from beauty as a political tool to beauty as a personal choice. The evolution reflects Germany's broader struggle to confront and transcend its past, while forging a new cultural identity rooted in autonomy, diversity, and self-expression. Today, the echoes of wartime beauty standards remain, but they exist within a society that values pluralism over conformity, choice over ideology, and personal expression over political symbolism.